Somewhere in the frozen archives of Moscow lies evidence of humanity's most forgotten triumph. A successful Mars landing that happened decades before the world knew about it. Between 1960 and 1971, the Soviet Union launched a series of top-secret missions to Mars that were systematically erased from history books. While NASA celebrated its moon landings, the Soviets were quietly attempting something far more ambitious, reaching the red planet first. Mars 3 didn't just reach the Martian surface. It made the first successful soft landing in human history. Today, we're uncovering the declassified truth about the Soviet Mars program that the world was never meant to know about.
The shadow launches.
October 1960 marked humanity's first attempt to leave Earth's gravitational influence and reach another planet. Mars, 1960. A lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome aboard a modified R-7 ICBM, but within seconds the rocket veered off course and self-destructed. 4 days later, Mars 1960B suffered the same fate-reaching orbit but never escaping Earth's pull before burning up in the atmosphere. These weren't just technical failures, they were national embarrassments that the Soviet space program couldn't afford to acknowledge. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, had promised Premier Khrushchev a Mars victory to match their successes with Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin. Instead, both missions were quietly reclassified as Cosmos satellites, a catch-all designation used to hide failed interplanetary attempts. Western intelligence agencies only learned about these missions decades later through declassified documents. The Soviet strategy was clear. If they couldn't succeed publicly, they would fail in complete secrecy. The engineers' work was a race against time, battling both the remoteness of space and the limitations of old technology. The successful restoration gave hope not only to the mission but also to
Mars 1, the lonely pioneer.
November 1962 brought the Soviet Union's first partial success with Mars 1, a probe that actually escaped Earth's gravity and began the long journey to the red planet. Launched during a narrow 26-month launch window, the spacecraft represented a technological leap forward, equipped with a magnetometer, cosmic dust detectors, and instruments designed to search for water vapor in the Martian atmosphere. For 124 million miles, Mars 1 transmitted data back to Earth, proving that interplanetary communication was possible. The spacecraft sent 61 successful transmissions before disaster struck on March 21, 1963. As Mars grew larger in the probe sensors, all contact was lost. Engineers at the Soviet Deep Space Network in Yevpatoria, Crimea waited desperately for signals, but Mars 1 had gone silent forever. The most likely cause was a leak in the attitude control gas tanks, which left the spacecraft spinning helplessly with its antenna pointing away from Earth. Despite the communication failure, Mars 1 proved the Soviets could reach interplanetary space, a crucial psychological victory that fueled their determination to continue.
The explosive disasters.
March 1969 witnessed one of the most spectacular failures in space exploration history. Mars, 1969. A sat atop a massive Proton K rocket at Baikonur, carrying the most advanced Mars probe ever built, a bus-sized spacecraft designed to orbit the planet and deploy a surface lander. The countdown proceeded normally until T+0 seconds, when the 2.4 million pound thrust rocket erupted into a fireball visible for miles. The explosion shattered windows in nearby villages and sent burning debris across the Kazakh steppes. 5 days later, Mars 1969B met an equally violent end when the upper stage failed during separation, sending the multi-million-dollar payload tumbling back to Earth. These catastrophic failures represented more than technical setbacks. They were existential crises for the Soviet space program. Vasily Mishin, who had taken over from Korolev after his death in 1966, faced intense pressure from the Politburo to deliver results. The twin explosions cost the USSR 2 years of preparation and millions of rubles, but more importantly, they handed NASA a clear advantage in the race to Mars.
Zond 2's silent journey.
Zond 2's silent journey. So, late in 1964 marked another Soviet attempt with Zond 2, a spacecraft that really represented the cutting edge of interplanetary technology. This mission carried experimental plasma thrusters, revolutionary ion propulsion systems that honestly had never been tested in deep space, along with an infrared spectrometer designed to detect vegetation on Mars. For 6 months, Zond 2 flew silently through the void, its experimental systems functioning perfectly as it approached the red planet. The spacecraft's trajectory was nearly perfect, aiming for a close flyby that would provide detailed images of the Martian surface. Controllers at the Soviet Mission Control Center in Kaliningrad maintained regular contact until suddenly, all transmissions just ceased. The probe missed Mars by approximately 1,000 miles, agonizingly close to success. Post-mission analysis suggested either a power system failure or a thermal control malfunction had crippled the spacecraft. Zond 2 joined the growing cemetery of Soviet hardware drifting in interplanetary space, another ghost probe carrying humanity's dreams but unable to fulfill them. Each failure taught valuable lessons, but the Soviets were running out of time and patience.
The M69 catastrophe.
The M69 catastrophe. 1969 was supposed to be the year the Soviet Union finally conquered Mars. After years of failures, Soviet engineers had designed the M69 series, massive, sophisticated spacecraft that would not only orbit Mars but also deploy landers to study the surface. Mars 1969, A, and Mars 1969. B represented the pinnacle of Soviet space technology, each weighing several tons and packed with advanced instruments. The missions were so secret that even their existence was classified until decades later. When both missions exploded during launch within 5 days of each other, it created a crisis at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Dmitry Ustinov, the defense minister overseeing space programs, personally intervened to prevent news of the disasters from reaching the public. The explosions were so violent they actually registered on seismic equipment, but official records listed them as routine Cosmos missions. These failures cost the Soviet Union more than money and prestige. They cost crucial time.
Mars 2, first impact.
November 27, 1971 became a historic date that, honestly, few people remember. Mars 2, the first component of the Soviet Union's most ambitious Mars mission, screamed through the Martian atmosphere at over 13,000 miles per hour. The lander was equipped with a parachute system, retro rockets, and even a small Prop-M rover designed to waddle across the surface on metal skis while tethered to the main lander. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The parachute system failed to deploy properly, the retro rockets never fired, and the lander slammed into the Martian surface with the force of a meteorite. There was no signal, no data transmission, just silence from the red planet. However, Mars 2 had achieved something unprecedented. It became the first human-made object to physically reach the surface of Mars. The impact occurred in the Hellas Basin, creating a small crater that remains there today, an unmarked grave for Soviet ambitions. While Western media focused on the failure, Soviet engineers quietly celebrated a grim milestone. They had touched another world, even if it meant destroying their spacecraft in the process.
Mars 3's miraculous landing.
Mars 3's miraculous landing on December 2, 1971, honestly rewrote the history of space exploration in just 14.5 seconds. Mars 3's lander descended through a massive planet-wide dust storm that had been raging for weeks, but somehow, everything worked perfectly. The parachute deployed, the retro rockets fired right on schedule, and the spacecraft made a controlled soft landing on the Martian surface. The first successful soft landing on another planet in human history. Controllers at the Deep Space Communication Center in Crimea erupted in celebration, as telemetry signals confirmed touchdown. For those precious seconds, humanity had a functioning robotic outpost on Mars, equipped with cameras, soil analysis equipment, and atmospheric sensors. The lander immediately began transmitting, sending back the first image ever captured from the surface of Mars. Then, as suddenly as it had begun working, Mars 3 fell silent forever. The transmission, it consisted mostly of gray static with some unclear features, but it represented humanity's first glimpse of Mars from ground level. The Prop-M rover was never deployed because the lander died too quickly. Somewhere in the Martian dust, that tiny robot still waits, a monument to Soviet engineering that survived the journey but just couldn't survive the destination.
The cover-up campaign.
Soviet space failures disappeared into a bureaucratic black hole of secrecy that lasted for decades. When Mars missions exploded during launch, they were immediately reclassified as Cosmos missions, generic designations that suggested routine Earth satellite deployments. Vladimir Chelomey, one of the chief designers, created an entire system for burying embarrassing failures behind false documentation. Launch manifests were altered, mission reports were classified, and even the engineers involved were sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment. The KGB monitored space program personnel to prevent leaks about failed missions. This wasn't just about hiding technical problems. It was about maintaining the Soviet Union's image as a space superpower. While NASA failures were broadcast on live television for the world to see, Soviet disasters vanished completely from public record. Western intelligence agencies sometimes detected mysterious launches through radar tracking, but without official confirmation, these missions remained ghosts in the historical record. The secrecy was so complete that many Soviet citizens never learned about their country's Mars program until after the USSR collapsed in 1991. This systematic cover-up meant that Soviet achievements, like Mars 3's successful landing, were also hidden from history.
The lost robot.
Buried somewhere in the Martian regolith lies Prop M, the Soviet Union's first Mars rover that never got to rove. This lunchbox-sized robot was designed to crawl away from the Mars 3 lander using metal skis, dragging a tether cable behind it to maintain communication. The rover carried a penetrometer to test soil density and 2 contact sensors to detect obstacles. Prop M was designed to operate for months, slowly mapping the immediate landing area and sending back detailed surface analysis. The rover represented groundbreaking engineering. It had no wheels because Soviet engineers worried they would clog with Martian dust. Instead, the robot was designed to slide forward on twin skis while explosive bolts periodically advanced the device in small hops. When Mars 3 died after 14.5 seconds, Prop M never received the deployment signal. The rover remains locked inside the lander, perfectly preserved by Mars's thin atmosphere and extreme cold. NASA's orbital reconnaissance has never located the Mars 3 landing site, meaning Prop M could remain lost forever. This tiny robot represents humanity's first attempt at mobile Mars exploration, a precursor to Sojourner, Spirit, Opportunity, and Perseverance that came decades later.
Hidden history revealed.
The full scope of Soviet Mars ambitions only became clear after 1991, when classified archives began opening to researchers. Documents revealed at least 18 secret Mars missions between 1960 and 1973, with many more attempts that remain classified. The Mars 3 success was deliberately downplayed even in internal Soviet documents because the 14.5-second transmission time seemed embarrassing compared to ongoing Apollo achievements. Roald Sagdiv, former director of the Soviet Space Research Institute, later admitted that political pressure forced engineers to attempt impossible deadlines with inadequate testing. Each mission failure cost millions of rubles and years of preparation, but the secrecy meant these lessons couldn't be shared with the international scientific community. The Soviet Mars program represented one of history's most ambitious scientific endeavors, combining cutting-edge technology with Cold War desperation. Mars 3's achievement, the first successful soft landing on Mars, remained largely unknown until decades after it happened. Today, as NASA and SpaceX plan human missions to Mars, they're building on foundations laid by Soviet engineers who dared to reach for another world in complete secrecy. The Red Planet conquered the Soviets, but not before they conquered it first. The Soviet Union reached Mars first, landed successfully, and sent back humanity's first surface image. But almost nobody knew about it. Mars 3's 14.5-second transmission represents one of history's most underappreciated achievements, buried by Cold War secrecy and overshadowed by moon landings. These declassified missions prove that space exploration's greatest victories sometimes happen in complete silence. The race to Mars wasn't won by the loudest publicity. It was won by engineers who dared to fail in secret until they finally succeeded. Subscribe to Stellar Tech for more hidden space history that rewrites everything you thought you knew about the cosmos.